everyone. Welcome to the Star Wars Canon. I'm Josh. This is Scott and Dan, and we're going to be talking about The Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule. So, fair warning, we are going to be diving into deep spoilers for the book, and we're going to be walking through each of the three sections that the book is split up into. So, Scott will be starting by walking us through the Great Disaster, which is the first section of the Eternal.
Cool. Yeah. So the Light of the Jedi kicks off with a section that they are calling the Great Disaster. It begins with the Legacy Run, a ship that's traveling through hyperspace. It's captained by Hedda Cassette, I believe is how you might say that name. And they're carrying mostly families and supplies sort of as people are expanding to the outer rims of the galaxy. And as they're traveling through hyperspace, hyperspace suddenly becomes like red, or they describe it as being sick almost looking. And it seems that there's something blocking sort of their way in the hyperspace lane. And they try to steer the Legacy Run around it and successfully sort of steer around it, from a actual driving perspective. But the ship itself is pretty old and can't keep up and starts to tear apart. And that basically causes a lot of the ship's debris to fall out of hyperspace in one moment, and it's coming out at sort of incredible speeds. And it's in an area called the Hetzel system that sort of is centered around a main planet, Hetzel Prime. And a lot of these pieces are coming out very fast. They are initially tracked by a couple Scantechs who are able to, before they're destroyed, their space station destroyed, send out an alert that they're sort of in distress and that all these other planets need to evacuate or attempt to sort of destroy or dodge these pieces of the Legacy Run as they come flying out. And amidst sort of this distress call, they're notified that the Jedi are coming to assist. And the Jedi, along with some other Republic ships and contractors and civilians and dignitaries, had been nearby as part of a program being led by Chancellor Lena Soh to sort of reach the outer rim and inner rim galaxies or planets from, expanding beyond the core of the galaxy via a space station called the Starlight Beacon that's sort of meant to be a hub to connect them and allow these other all the galaxy to sort of communicate and trade with each other in a more unified way. So on this space station happens to be Jedi Master Avar Kriss, who's kind of overseeing this. Within that sort of greater area, we're introduced to a couple other Jedi immediately. Loden Greatstorm and their Padawan Bel Zettifar, another Jedi Te-Ami, Nib Asek and their Padawan Buryaga, and then Elzar Mann, who is not yet considered a master, I believe, yet, is one of the things, is that Elzar is a pretty powerful Jedi, but kind of does his own thing. And so kind of just based on tradition of the way you get promoted to Jedi Masters, always struggled to get the approval to be able to sort of do his own thing and have that rank. Within this group, you also have a lot of Force users, non-Jedi. There's some pilots. One of the main ones that we are introduced to is Joss and Pika Adren, who were contracted to work on the Starlight Beacon in the Star Wars Insider sort of short story that is in the magazine for this month. It's kind of a prequel to this book. That's mostly talks about them and sort of their work within the Starlight Beacon, that Joss is kind of the mechanical one and his wife is the sort of vision behind things. And they were the basic people that made sure everything was running smoothly. All bugs and everything were cleaned up in the Starlight Beacon before it was going to be able to sort of be finalized and go live. And they were actually on their way to a vacation when this happened and kind of abandoned that to volunteer and help save the day as best they could. So all of these people sort of come into the Hetzel Prime region, or the Hetzel system rather, around Hetzel Prime, to try and do as best they can to either snag and destroy the different debris as it's coming out of hyperspace. Their intention originally is mostly to destroy it, but Buryaga, the Padawan of Nib Assek, as they're about to blow up a large piece of debris that's heading towards a planet, sort of senses that there's people inside of them, and they realize that some of these are some of the passenger cargo portions or passenger containers that have been isolated as they were sort of split apart and have survivors in it. So the Jedi alongside different pilots all start to work together to sort of contain those. We have a really cool scene where the Avar Kriss alongside Jedi who are in their vectors, which are kind of the Jedi small, swift ships that have weapons that are powered by their lightsabers, has a really cool thing where they sort of place their lightsaber into a little hub to power the weapons on their ships. They all, in a Professor Xavier-esque sort of sense, combine all their, like, connect to all the Jedi across the galaxy and use their power together to slow down, you know, a piece of this ship, and then use the non-force users that are piloting these more cargo, larger ships have these tow truck-esque latch things, magnetic latch things they can shoot out and attach to it to basically slow down these pieces. And then eventually they come across a very large sort of piece that contains some fuel that's leaking out, and that type of fuel mixed with the sun would detonate and kind of destroy the planets in that surrounding area. And they have to sort of all collectively use their force powers to push that out of the way. And then sort of using those things that they've learned from that of ways to slow down the debris or shift it around together, sort of culminates the sort of first element of the great disaster, so that they can start to sort of save survivors or destroy pieces or move pieces and sort of prevent as much further damage as they can. I know that just across this first wave, they, you know, talk about that millions upon millions of people are killed just from the initial pieces that are moving too fast for them to slow down. But that's sort of what culminates what they consider to be the great disaster, and is the inciting sort of event of this book.
Yeah, Scott, first of all, great summary of this first section of the book. And just for everyone's reference, and again, hopefully everyone's read the book, and if not, check it out. The book is really separated into thirds. So the great disaster encompasses the first third of the book. And it really is kind of just overviewing this event in the Hetzel system, this disaster that happened with the Legacy Run. I thought, from my perspective, this was really exciting and interesting. It felt like a disaster movie in the Star Wars universe. It was really just very fascinating to see kind of all the different characters kind of scrambling into action and having to deal with these different crises. And something I really like that Soule did was he has kind of this constant countdown to the bigger impact that will happen. I believe it's on one of the moons of Hetzel Prime. There's a moon called the fruited moon and the rooted moon, two moons, and one of these pieces of the Legacy Run it's on a collision course with one of the moons, and they state that if it hits the moon, 20 billion people will die. So right away we get these huge stakes. We're not talking about hundreds of people. There's literally billions of people at stake. And with every chapter in this section, it's a countdown to that impending impact on the moon. So I felt like they did a great job of kind of amping up the stakes right away, and also keeping that tension from chapter to chapter, and you not really knowing, if they were going to actually pull this off and save the day in the end. What do you think, Dan, about this first section?
I actually think the first section might have been my favorite section. Like I liked all three, but I just thought it was such a cool, different thing for Star Wars to have a disaster to deal with. Like, we're always dealing with the Empire or like the known bad guys, but I thought it was kind of cool that it was not clear what was the cause at first, and you're trying to just take care of the problem, and seeing Jedi like scramble was like sort of like Avengers Endgame or something of Jedi. Like they're just doing everything they can and like at maximum kind of superpower level. I also thought format wise, the countdown thing was cool. I listened to the book. I didn't read it. Like I did all through Audible. And so they just like changed the tone and the voice when it got to that countdown sound each time, which made it just feel like weightier and weightier, like this problem was going to, impact us at any moment. Some of the stuff for me that was just super cool is the Jedi things. I mean, everything we saw with Jedi there was like Jedi things we've never seen before. The vectors, the ships, and how they work with the lightsaber as kind of like almost the key to the ship that unlocks its potential and power, and then their ability to like force sync, for lack of a better term, with each other, so that they're like flying in unison and eventually working in unison to move objects through space. It was just really cool to see, and things that kind of you just like imagine as a kid playing with like your Jedi figures, but definitely not anything we've ever seen Jedi do in any other previous Star Wars stuff.
Yeah, I thought the vector stuff, the Jedi's flying these fighters, and how they I almost had a mind meld when flying them, and were able to do all these complex maneuvers because of their connection to the Force. I thought it was fascinating, particularly because we've seen Jedi in canon be very great at piloting, particularly Jedi like Anakin and Saesee Tin, but to see them work together in this way and then kind of just be so in sync, I thought that was such a unique thing. I also really love that we were introduced to all these characters in this moment of crisis. So you immediately kind of get a sense for who they are and kind of how they respond under pressure, which is fairly unique when meeting characters. It certainly wasn't a boring way to introduce them in any respect.
Yeah, I liked that.
I think that's a good point about. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I was going to say that I liked that the way the storytelling occurs is that every chapter sort of changes, not to just tell the story, but the voice of who the chapter is being told from, whether it's a ship captain, whether it's a politician, whether it's a Padawan, whether it's a Jedi. You see a lot of different voices come through in this opening third and throughout the rest of the book. But I think it's really interesting to see in the face of disaster sort of how each people are reacting, and especially between Loden Greatstorm and Bel Zettifar. For this portion of it, they're actually starting in the air, but they actually move to the ground to help with some evacuation efforts. And in the midst of it, it's a sense of urgency and whatnot, but Loden Greatstorm is still like making the Padawan make the decisions, and is using this as a teaching time, using this opportunity to guide Bel, further in the Force and further through his training. So it's really interesting and they do a great job. Charles Soule does a really good job of sort of not only introducing you to this time period and to the way sort of society and Jedi functions at this time, but these characters and the unique voices that I assume, many of them will be seen for the next few years as we go through the High Republic.
Yeah, I think Loden and Bel's relationship is maybe one of my favorite relationships in the book. Just the way that it evolves and the direction that it ultimately goes in, which we'll get into. I think that one was the one I was most invested in. And I think, as we look forward to the rest of the High Republic, I'm very interested to see where those two characters go.
Yeah, I think worth noting too that within this initial piece, we are jumping in each chapter around these characters quite a bit. So you're like focusing on Loden, then focusing on, Avar Kriss, and like bouncing back and forth between these groups. But I did think what was cool with the Jedi in general is that they seemed calm through the whole thing. Like almost like in Loden's case, almost comically calm, I felt like, where he was just like, well, this is just a teaching moment for Bel. Like I'll run him through the paces. but it was really cool to see that because you could tell they were so attuned to the Force. That they were more like sensing the problems than needing to express them. Loden for me is definitely my favorite character throughout the whole book. I mean, a really cool, interesting character, and has some of the feelings you get from the Masters of maybe the prequel era, but like just like a more calm, like chill demeanor about it that I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, Loden comes off as a a normal person in some ways. And we should note, I believe Loden is a Twi'lek, and Bell's a human, but Loden, yeah, I think you're right on, Dan. He has this very like laid back approach to things while also being extremely self-assured and confident in what he's doing. And I think his teaching approach, as you kind of said, Scott, which is like, just kind of let Bell figure out everything. He's only going to learn if he does things himself. I think that was just really interesting and said a lot about their relationship. One of the other things I wanted to note was, to your point, Dan, about kind of the Jedi depicted as calm. I also like that every character, but in particular every Jedi, had a very unique personality, and in particular, Soule makes a point of kind of digging into how each of them view the Force and kind of connect to the Force, and they all have their different strengths and weaknesses. And we talk a little bit about the vectors and then having this mind meld kind of thing, but Avar Kriss actually has this ability to kind of connect all the Jedi across not only the Hetzel system, but it seems like she has the ability to connect Jedi who are all across the galaxy and kind of just use this almost this neural network to allow them to sync in unison, which I thought was, again, just incredible and expanding kind of this notion that we have of the Force in a very exciting way.
Yeah, I really liked that element of it. I like I was saying, it almost was this like Cerebro X-Men kind of thing, where once we got to having to move the gas, I think it was Tabana gas that they were saying was leaking out, that element that they referenced, that it wasn't just the Jedi in that region, it was just the Jedi helping the cleanup, that they were reaching across the galaxy to like thousands of Jedi and kind of pulling their powers together to sort of help shift this massive thing that was hurtling towards the sun just off its trajectory. But I agree, yeah, the way this opening sort of third treats the Force and introduces new elements to the Force, and I think what's an obvious reflection sort of in the Jedi's personalities that you guys were mentioning is that this has been, for most of these Jedi, like a time of peace, in the terms of the time that they've been Jedi. They've been helping society. They aren't soldiers per se. They're peacekeepers in the sense of like they're doing good. They're respected. So you do kind of see that in the way that some of the Jedi are sort of treating their Padawans or interacting with other people. One example was that when they're kind of all trying to use the Force together, that Buryaga is unable to sort of stay in the sort of mind meld with them to help, slow down a thing. And it turns out that that's because he was, extra sensitive to the fact that there were survivors in this debris. And that's what was like speaking to him and keeping him from unable to be able to focus and sort of stay attached to that item. But their response is to him of like, hey, like, it's okay that like you aren't able to do this right now, before they know that that's the reason why. They're like, just like, take this one. Like, you can just sit out this one. We've got this one, and then the same with Loden and Bell throughout the book. There's a running, storyline of Bell not being able to do a Force jump and like jump from a high distance and land, that we've seen or done in all the movies and games and books and comics for years. That every time though, Loden or someone else is there always to catch him, because they know that Bell's, might not be able to do it. And they're not seen as like a failure. They're seen as just a learning process, that he's, yet to connect with the Force in this one element, but he's good in other elements, and they know that, so I think there's a lot of I guess, non-warring sort of Force respect and information that's dropped in this first third of the book or third section of the book, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing that the book makes apparent very quickly is, again, these stakes are very high. People, characters will die. There's several characters uh, throughout the book, but particularly in this first section that you're introduced to. For instance, there's this Republic captain, Captain Bright, who him and his crew go on this rescue mission um, to one of the, I think, space stations in the Hetzel system, and there's some survivors there that they feel like they can evacuate. And in the process of evacuating, Bright kind of stays behind and sacrifices himself to save the survivors and his crew. And at that point, you've spent multiple chapters kind of learning about his character and kind of getting invested very quickly into the character, and then he's dead. Which for me, I appreciate it. It did again lend this gravity to the situation and felt more like the real world scenario where people are gonna die in the process.
Yeah, I think even the opening chapter, they very instantly get you attached to Hedda Cassette and go through their history and the history of the ship and what their purpose is and all the good work they're doing and helping with the expansion of the galaxy and reaching the Outer Rim people. And that is the only chapter for that character. That character dies at the very last line of that chapter.
Yeah, and
I was surprised in general by the amount of death in the book. I just felt like there was a fair amount of people who died in each of these parts throughout it that you weren't expecting, I guess, from Star Wars. Typically, they're a little bit nicer with death. This was a lot grittier in general. I mean, obviously, we start with like 40 million people dying, but in addition to that, it's a lot of characters that you're starting to really like and respect and feel good about. And there's a bit of a Game of Thrones feel to their willingness to just kind of like cut them.
Yeah, totally. And I think beyond just, kind of regular people, so to speak, you get a lot of Jedi who die too during the course of this book. And, as Scott was mentioning during his outline, this section kind of reaches its climax when you have all the Jedi kind of spearheaded by Avar Kriss trying to stop this section of the Legacy Run that had the Savannah gas on it from hitting one of his sons and kind of incinerating everything in the sector. And it's such a strain on the Jedi to do this. Well, some of them are passing out, some of them are falling off things and dying because it's such a tremendous strain on them to use the Force in this way. And one of the things that kind of reminded me of was Last Jedi, when Luke is using all this power to project himself across the galaxy, and clearly, that had a toll on him because he flashed after. But they make it very apparent that Jedi are amazing and hugely skilled, but they're not invincible, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Last Jedi parallel piece, and I don't want to like scare anyone who's not a Last Jedi fan about it because it has nothing to do with it. But I did think that the powers that we saw in Last Jedi, like this explained those powers in better ways. First with the Luke version of that, the Force projection, they didn't actually project physically, but they projected mentally to move something physically, which I feel like has very similar properties. But I also thought Avar Kriss's power to like that neural network is sort of a power that we've seen Leia have throughout Star Wars that never really is explained. Like she always just seems to feel everyone at some point somewhere over a long distance. And I always thought it was just an interesting power because like, is she constantly attuned to them? Kind of explained it in like more, I don't know, internet style way that like they're kind of all linked through this force wave and kind of connect to each other.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say that they also, the way they describe her as a Jedi is different than the other Jedis. The other ones they'll talk about like the relationship between the Padawan and the Master or some of their history. Some of them have like, like these, storied, have gone through different roles and been warriors and whatnot, or they describe their unique saber and things like that. With the case of Avar Kriss, they do describe that like that is her role as a Jedi, is to sort of stay in this one position and commune with all the other Force Jedi and keep them connected across the galaxy, and that's sort of what she does as a Jedi. That's where her strength lies with the Force.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we talked about this a little bit when we first started the book, but like it's sort of like doctors that are all specialized right now. Like I feel like each of them have their kind of specialty focus. They're doctors in general, so they can kind of do it all. But I thought that was kind of cool. I'd never seen that with Jedi in any other era where there was like specialties between them.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, Dan. And I think your point as to, seeing Jedi not only being able to use the Force to sense things across the galaxy, but also be able to actually manipulate things in space that are not directly in front of them was pretty wild and something I don't think we ever seen before. The other thing I wanted to mention while we were on the topic of Last Jedi, it seems to me that Soule kind of, took that idea that Ryan Johnson introduced in terms of hyperspace being something that could be weaponized, and kind of ran with that in a huge way. This book dives into hyperspace more than anything I think that exists in the canon, and frankly, it's I think a pretty fascinating concept that you have these fragments of ships that are just emerging, fragments of the ship that are emerging from hyperspace and are like now these weapons of mass destruction, essentially. What an interesting concept, and something that hasn't been explored in Star Wars before outside of Last Jedi, but definitely a very, very interesting way to start the story.
Yeah, I think that in general is kind of an interesting thing too, of just knowing that this takes place so far previous to anything we've seen.
Yeah.
Outside of something, like some of the games and whatnot that have some sort of more historic origins, was that, yeah, they don't, we take for granted that they like just jump in hyperspace so freely in the movies and comics and shows and stuff. But at this time period, they really almost kind of have like a highway that they take when they're wanting to do this main lane. And then if they're not in that, it's like, they're on the 25 mile per hour surface street to go, anything outside of that. So it will be interesting to see. And I know part of it probably will, plays into the rest of the story of, the development of being able to hyper jump a lot more freely as time goes on.
I think that also kind of ties in to Rise of Skywalker, with how we see Ben having to travel through to get to Exegol also, and like the Wayfinder. And when that first was introduced, I was kind of surprised because I just thought, oh, you want to get to this planet, you just, jump to this planet. But it does make a lot of sense in these uncharted areas that you need like a clean path, or you might end up in the middle of something, which they've mentioned many times in Star Wars, but you just don't think about it. In this time, they're like pioneers, they're still trying to like go and discover and like settle in new areas. And this whole concept of hyperspace lanes and how they work and the paths that it takes, which will lead us, I guess, into the next section. But that was very new to me as a concept, but it makes perfect sense. Like if you really try to think about how would you travel throughout the galaxy like that and not end up in the middle of a planet or a moon or an asteroid, you'd need a clear path and plan.
Yeah, I think to that point, Sudan, something that stuck out to me is I think Soule did a really good job of making it feel very distinctly Star Wars, but there was enough kind of sprinkled throughout that gave you a sense of the period relative to what we've seen in the rest of canon, and things like, oh, Bacta is a new thing. It's just starting to be developed. And kind of just small little hints that gave you a sense of, okay, this is, not what we're used to. It's farther back, but also felt, intrinsically Star Wars. Like you've never felt like you weren't in a Star Wars story.
Yeah, definitely had some westward expansion feel going on too, that like era in American history with it.
Yeah,
For sure.
Before maybe before Scott, you run us through the next section. The only other thing I wanted to mention, because he is a fairly substantial character in the rest of the book, but there is I guess what you would call like an engineer character on Hetzel Prime, Kevin Tar.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he's an interesting character because just a regular kind of person who I think is part of maybe the Hetzel Prime government. But uh, in this first section, he actually figures out kind of how to, I guess, route all the satellite imagery to give them a sense for what's actually happening in the system, and then that often leads to him becoming a much larger player in how the rest of the story plays out. So I want to make sure we mention kind of how we're introduced to him in this first section.
Mm-hmm. For sure.